Okay, good afternoon from Austin, Texas. On behalf of the NMC, I'm happy to welcome you to the NMC Beyond the Horizon, Facilitating Discovery of Learning Technologies. Our topic today is featured in our recent publication, Scaling Solutions to Higher Education's Biggest Challenges, an NMC Horizon Project Strategic Brief. If you haven't had a chance to look at that document, their description for this challenge is the following. Faculty may be motivated to adopt learning technologies when evidence indicates that students will benefit. They cannot always find reputable information about technology's impact on teaching and learning. While the availability of new tools and communities of practice present first steps to aid institutional decision makers, technology discovery and selection remain a complex web of considerations. These considerations that we're going to take have some thoughtful discussion about today. So Annie, if you can drop in the link to the publication so that people have that handy. Okay, in this 1 hour event, we'll begin with two higher education thought leaders sharing their insights on their approaches to solving this challenge. And then I will assign each of you in two breakout rooms where you'll work in small groups to engage in deeper discussion about this topic and begin brainstorming solutions to this challenge. I am your host today, Alex Freeman. I am the Senior Director of Membership and Special Projects at the NMC. I'm joined by the NMC's Gordon Jackson and Annie Davis. If you're on Twitter, that's great, because so are we. Our hashtag for today's event is DLNChat. That's hashtag DLNChat. As I mentioned, we're going to have a working session today that will require active participation. We don't have all the answers here, but we're looking to you, our group of thought leaders, participants, to help solve these challenges with our two facilitators and presenters today who have made some progress in their environment. So before I get intro with our first speaker, I want to conduct our second poll real quickly and asking about where you are within this challenge, whether you're getting started, you're in the middle, or you have a lot of experience, or you're just here to learn some more. Go ahead and take a moment to do that. As I mentioned, this is going to be an active learning session, so you will be able to have your camera available and turned on. So if you'd like to do that, you can do so. At minimum, once we get into the breakout rooms, you'll have an opportunity to unmute your microphones and begin talking a little bit about yourself and about your context when we get into that portion. So it looks like we have getting some answers here, and looks like a good majority here are here to learn more about the topic, and then evenly a few of you are just getting started and a few of you have a lot of experience. So most of the people here today, looks like we're just here to learn more about the topic. So I'll leave that up for just another moment, but we're giving us a good indication of who the attendees are today. I'm glad we had a nice big turnout. So just another moment on here, and I'll share this out. There we go. So as you can see, lots of people wanted to learn more, which is great. So let's learn some more. Our first presenter for today is Christopher Brooks. He serves as the Interim Director of Research for the EDUCAUSE Center for Analysis and Research, also known as ECAR. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to you, Christopher.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to see about getting my slides up here so that you don't have to look at me anymore. You can just see the stuff we're going to talk about. There we go. I think that should be working well for you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today and for being willing to spend a few minutes with me, listen to what I have to say about this topic. Asked by Eden Dahlstrom, who used to be the Director of Research at EDUCAUSE, so we know each other fairly well. And she had some ideas based on some of the research that we've done previously that might be related to this topic. And so kind of as an overview of what I'm going to walk through today in the next few minutes is what we kind of know about faculty and how they relate or think about technology, and what faculty say that will actually motivate them to integrate technology into their teaching and learning. And then at the end, I'm going to make a couple of recommendations for some next steps to think about empowering faculty or to think about things that you might need to consider to move forward. So to start off with, the data that I'm going to be including here is drawn from 2015 ECAR study of faculty and information technology. That is the last faculty study that ECAR produced 2 years ago. The first one came out in 2014, we did another in 2015, and then decided to move it to a biannual production. So the next one of these should be dropping early this fall, hopefully in September of this year. The data that I'm pulling up here comes from this. The first thing I want to address are some stereotypes that we have about faculty versus what we kind of know from the empirical research that we've been able to do at ECAR. And I think typically we like to have two stereotypes or ideal types of faculty when it comes to thinking about technology. And one of these is the fave, or the faculty that is against virtually everything. And I'm going to pause here for a moment and give credit to my partner in crime today, Kyle Bowen, who actually designed this and the next graphic here. I use these quite frequently, and they're brilliant. So I borrowed them from him today for this project. But as you can see, from this notion of faculty being against virtually everything, they're sort of Luddite in their disposition with bow ties and patches on their elbows, and it's kind of surprising that they might even have an overhead projector as being sort of the high-tech version of what they're using in the classroom. And then on the other end of things is another faculty member that we probably think of as an ideal or a stereotype, which is the faculty into virtually everything. They have every new gadget going. They are cheerleaders left and right of every new sort of innovation and gadget that comes along, whether or not there's any evidence to support its effectiveness or not. They are just sort of teched out to the proverbial guild. Now, these are stereotypes, which means that they are extreme versions of what we might think about faculty. And the reality is that neither of these remotely or accurately portray where faculty actually are. And we collected data for the first two faculty studies that we did on where faculty place themselves in terms of their disposition and attitude and usage patterns of technology. And we did this using what we call a semantic differential scale. It was a 100-point scale bounded on both ends by opposite concepts. And together those concepts would load into these respective constructs of disposition, attitude, and usage. And what we found out on that 100-point scale is that faculty are neither faves nor fives. They are also significantly above the middle point of that in the direction of the fives. So this kind of undermines maybe the stereotypical notion that we have of faculty being kind of Luddites or technology curmudgeons. They seem to be engaged with technology. They have a positive disposition towards it, which means that they are either enthusiastic or technophilia, or have a technophilia about them. They have positive attitudes, seeing it as useful or as an enhancement to their teaching or learning, and that they are more likely to be always than never connected, and perhaps see technology as being more central to their lives. Now, what's interesting also about this data is the way in which these numbers cluster together. They're all within a 10-point range on the upper end of this scale, which means there's a fairly consistent orientation that faculty have towards these, towards the notion of technology in their teaching. And these numbers are actually very similar to what we observed with students. So we did the same survey with students, and they align fairly closely in the same direction. So that not only undermines the notion on the student side of a digital native, because they're not purely at the end of kind of the high end of the extreme, but it also says that there's probably not a lot of difference between the way that students and faculty think about, use, and relate to technology on a regular basis. So if we already know that faculty are more positively oriented than negatively oriented, how might we actually get them motivated to incorporate that technology into their teaching and curriculum? So we had, I think, a series of 14 items that we asked faculty to rank. They could choose their top 3. And of those 14 items, the number one that came out as the clear unanimous number one across the board, across all 7 Carnegie classes that we looked at, was having clear evidence or indications that students would benefit from the technological intervention. And that, I think, is particularly important and interesting because there is an abundance of information and research on the impact of educational technology, specifically or technologies in general that could help faculty to think about how to use that technology in class. The problem is that many educational technology journals may be unfamiliar to faculty that are more disciplinarily bound, and that oftentimes good research is buried in disciplinary teaching and learning journals. So if I'm a political scientist and I'm looking at my teaching and learning journal and not finding anything about the particular thing that I'm wanting to do, I may not be aware that I might need to look in the chemistry teaching and learning journals or in the family social science teaching and learning journals there. So just because we may not know that they're out there doesn't mean that this data and this evidence does not exist. And I would suggest that those who are interested in it, there are ways to find it and seek out the help of librarians or others who might have expertise in this to help guide you. But not only is it a good idea for where to find this kind of information, it also provides you with an idea of where you might publish your own scholarship of teaching and learning pieces should you decide to wade into those waters. So if you want to collect evaluation or assessment data on your own interventions, it would be helpful to know where good outlets for that kind of research might reside. The second thing that we see that's kind of consistently across the board of these 7 Carnegie classes, although it appears in the second and third places, is the notion that faculty want some degree of confidence that technology would work the way that they planned. And in this study, we interpreted this primarily that faculty want some semblance of reliable, if not standardized technology in the classrooms in which they teach. So that if they've planned to do a particular activity, that the technology will work in the way that it's supposed to, and that they have reliable technology if they have to switch classrooms throughout the course of the day. There is an alternative potential interpretation to this, is that there might be a fear of having technology fails in class. And those of us who have been around technology realize that we have technology fails on a consistent basis. And on some level, we just need to kind of roll with them a little bit. If faculty are fearful, perhaps, of what students might think of them if they have technology fails, it's also good to know that students think actually very highly and positively of faculty and their technological abilities in the classroom. The third thing that we can note here, but I won't go into this a whole lot more deeply, is that faculty would like a better understanding of the technologies that are relevant to their teaching and learning. And I'll just say really quickly here is that EDUCAUSE has plenty of evidence that IT organizations provide individual training options, group training options, and instructional technologists to assist with integration of technology into teaching practices. So something like between 93 and 99% of institutions have these things. So if folks aren't using them or aren't aware of them, there's probably one of two things that are happening there. One is that maybe IT organizations aren't advertising them and putting them under the nose of the faculty that need them, as well as they perhaps should. And the other is related to one of the other items that you see in this particular figure, is not having enough time to actually explore them. And so it's very possible that faculty know that these things exist, but they simply do not have the time to engage in them given their teaching, research, and service obligations. We also provided a graphic depiction of the 14 items in terms of their ranking. So this is the percentage of respondents ranking them in their top 3. And as you can see, again, at the very top is the clear evidence or indication that students would benefit from these things. But there are actually 5 clusters of things within this graphic. The first is that there are compensation issues, and I'm sorry, the phone is ringing and I don't want to get up and answer it. So my apologies for that. One of the perils of working at home. So the second group that we have there are assistance and evidence. So things like IT support, teaching assistance, and the evidence that we've already discussed. Another dimension is professional development opportunities. A fourth one is having instructional design or support in teaching. And then lastly, having support either from peers or from cohorts. But some general observations that come out of the rank ordering of these particular items, I think, is worthy of note. First of all, many things at or near the top of this list are either relatively or readily available or relatively easy to obtain, with the exception of perhaps release time. But release time, compared to other forms of compensation, such as money or changing the tenure structure, is relatively easy to accomplish. Compensation items tend to be distributed, so time is near the top, but tenure, which is more difficult, is at the bottom. So the easier things are distributed that way. It's also evident that peer pressure doesn't seem to matter, but that having a supportive cohort does. So perhaps participating in a faculty development program as a group can be helpful that way. And that we also see that students' expectations around technology don't really seem to be a factor here. I'm going to quickly turn to a project that I did when I was at the University of Minnesota, and we actually published it in the EDUCAUSE review, but it was a faculty fellowship program that covered 18 months. Faculty got a stipend. They received technology, design, and research support during that, and were responsible for their individual projects as well as a collaborative project. And this article covers that collaborative project, as well as provides a link to the actual white paper that we produced, which is something of a manifesto regarding how faculty can fundamentally change their institutions when it comes to faculty development programs promoting excellence of teaching and learning with technology. There are 6 dimensions that they look at there, and they break out with actual bullet-pointed recommendations that can be done at 3 different levels: at the university level, at the college and departmental level, and at the individual instructor level. So if folks are thinking that they need these opportunities or that they need to somehow fundamentally transform the way that they're working there, I highly recommend visiting this article, taking a look at this report, and seeing what you might be able to take out of it to help you think about shaping your own institution's approach to technology and teaching. The last thing that I would suggest, based on that last graph that we saw, is that faculty aren't paying attention to what students are saying, or what their expectations about technology happen to be. And I would actually suggest that we need to pay attention to what students are doing with their technology. We have our undergraduate students in information technology reports available on an annual basis. This is the cover of the most recent one there. But part of the reason it's important to look at this is that, first of all, faculty perceptions of students and how students use technology are not necessarily grounded in reality. For example, there are vast discrepancies between how faculty think students are using their devices in class and how students actually report using their devices in class. So if faculty are thinking students are using them in one way and then are basing policies about the use of those devices in class in another way, they're perhaps ignoring both how students are using them, but also how important those things happen to be for students' academic success. So the next one of these reports will also come out around the same time as the new faculty one this fall, hopefully September. So I'm going to stop there because I think I probably am over time. I'm not absolutely sure, but thank you for your time and for listening, and I'm going to try to figure out how to not share my screen anymore. There we go.
All right, thank you, Christopher. Now into our second presentation to kick off the program is from Kyle Bowen. Kyle Bowen is the Director of Education Technology Services at Penn State, and he leads the university's efforts for the effective uses of technologies for teaching and learning. So take that away, Kyle.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for having me. And it's really great, having kind of that setup from Chris, because it really provides, that really great overlook as we think about how to engage our faculty. Those are many of the factors that we take into account. And really what I wanted to talk about today was, how do we think about or distill down some of that understanding in terms of how we introduce technology? How do we think about, how to get at the measurement of the effectiveness of those tools and how to approach them? Because what we see is this really interesting feature where technology that we have today is really kind of a modern day Rorschach test, where it really doesn't matter what you see in the technology, but rather how you react to what that technology is. And increasingly, the selection or identification of the technology you're using becomes this highly personalized choice. And it really becomes, in some cases, a status symbol almost. Whereas if you think about your choice of smartphone, usually that represents some kind of personal choice that you've made. And so how do we kind of take that and blend that into this conversation? And what we see is that as an institution, we can look at technology adoption, and we're all generally familiar with the technology adoption curve, where we have kind of early adopters on one end and laggards that default to the other. But if we begin to overlay that with the degrees of impact that a technology has, what we see is the cost of that impact being its high, or the impact and its cost being the highest at the earliest stage of whatever that technology is, and it tends to become more common over time. So if you think about, for example, the first person to use a learning management system, that was a highly impactful change that was also at its time very expensive, required a lot of effort, and then it transitions to the point where today it's a very common activity, and it's been commoditized in a lot of different ways. So when we think about emerging technologies and the adoption of technology, really it kind of fits into this space. And we have to translate it a number of ways, because as Chris was talking about, there's a increasing change in terms of the expectations of our students. And that's where, if we think about a kind of update to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that before I can begin to engage in learning, really there's this kind of underlying need to provide Wi-Fi and power, that it becomes this starting point where all my classes or all my learning gets started. And so as we think about this, we have this struggle where we want to think, well, I'm just kind of I don't have ideas. I don't know where to go with this. And the reality of the situation is it's not really about having the ideas. It's about kind of engaging people, having conversations about experimenting and trying different things. And what we see is this experiment tends to fall into these quadrants. And so if as we think about technology and the engagement of technology by our faculty and students, that we look at it in terms of its maturity of that technology versus the depth of that engagement. So in some cases, it may be a very small kind of evaluations. We have, a person kind of having with a technology or an idea, and they're kind of experimenting with it, maybe without students, just kind of on their own, versus full-on kind of production implementations of those technologies. And what we need to realize is that it's not just one practice, but rather a collection of things that help us explore different tools. And so we can begin to look at them in different ways. But as we think about and explore some of these tools, it can be helpful to kind of revisit why it is that we would want to think or take on some of these technologies. And that's where we introduce what I refer to as kind of the UNO rules, right? That there's the skip, which is basically if I look at a technology or I look at kind of the inclusion of that technology into learning, what can be left out? What can we take from this process that maybe was there before, and does that change this arrangement for us? There's the reversal, meaning what can I do that now that I couldn't do before? So let's say I didn't apply this, and so like in this case, maybe it's literally, as an example, what can be flipped? Well, flipped classroom is actually an example of this. So how can I take something that rather than doing it in class, I can now do it out of class? And so I can apply some kind of reversal to that. And then the last one is the wild card, which is what is the common element in all of these situations and all of these uses of technology that I can change. And I can change any one variable in there to get a different set of outcomes. So these are all different questions or ways of framing thinking around any particular technology. But the key issue, the key thing to keep in mind is as you're approaching this, as you're thinking about tools and technologies, to think about scale. And because this is where you get from one person doing it in one class to all classes doing it. And if we think about examples over time where we've had one person doing something, experimenting with their class, in the history of everything that ever worked, there was a time when it didn't. And so this is where we have to begin to think about what does scale look like, even at the earliest stages. And that's where it's important to think about and talk about the difference between growth versus scale. And so when we think about growth, many times we think about adoption. So what are our adoption numbers? So how many faculty, how many students have consumed that? And that's a notion of growth, meaning rather than having one, I just have now more than one. And it's all on the same vector, but it's just growing until it fully consumes whatever available resource comes to play. And so in some cases, this can be really dangerous because in many ways you're unprepared for that outcome, that it's just kind of replicated itself over and over again. And so when we talk about scale, there's a need to think about, well, no, it's actually a reconfiguration over time so that it's growing in multiple different dimensions. And so we think about, all the faculty engagement that it needs to happen, the faculty development needs to happen, the course redesigns that can happen around these. So all of the different dimensions. So it's not just a matter of adoption, meaning I have more people doing it. It's now a question of how do we more effectively implement this in each and every case. So to kind of break down an example of this that we just went through here at Penn State, so this is a practical example, was around immersive experiences. And so really what we're seeing is this quick growth, rapid evolving area around immersive technologies like virtual reality. And what we see is that these immersive technologies exist inside of a spectrum, that at the very bottom are things like 3D movies, and then we can look at 360-degree video, and then becomes virtual reality, so fully immersive environments, and then kind of the highest level is around augmented reality. So this is like your HoloLens and things like that. But what we see is that the spectrum is happening. We have change happening inside of this environment, that as we think about kind of the maturity of these tools and the ways that they're scaling, that they're kind of all over the place, right? That some are more mature, they've been around a while, or they hinge on older technologies that have been around, or we're seeing very early stage technologies that aren't really ready to scale, whether it be for cost or because the technology doesn't really support scaling in that way. And so as we approach this, and we see increasing need by our faculty and students to have access to these technologies and really the ability to include immersive experience as part of, the creation of immersive media parts of a course, or the experiencing of immersive environments. So what we did was we engaged in a series of experiments at a very early level and said, okay, how do we begin to understand what does it mean for an immersive experience to happen inside of a group? And then what we quickly learned was the impact that virtual experiences have on physical spaces. And so this was one experiment we did where, okay, if we want to have collections of students all kind of sharing in a virtual experience, we should put them around a table, we can have them put the headset on, and they can have those experiences. And then what we see, though, is that it quickly becomes chaotic, because if you've heard the saying like herding cats, well, now you're herding blindfolded cats, right? Because you have a headset on, you're effectively blindfolded. And so the first thing that happens is the students run into the table, they push themselves away from the table, and now they're running into each other. And so there is this need to think about, well, what does a physical space look like for an immersive experience? And that's what we've discovered, is that there's this virtual hamster ball that envelops a student when they're in a virtual environment. And so as we begin to design space, it's no longer a question of where the student is at, but rather where do they have the potential to be? And then we can design spaces around these kind of virtualized hamster balls. And so what that led us to was a space design that went into a pinwheel configuration. And so what this did was it enabled us to bring in students into groups, engage in virtual experiences, which are originally designed to be independent experiences, now are designed and made possible through effective space design. So we can bring that to scale. We can redesign this in multiple different vectors, meaning it wasn't just about having a headset for each student, but rather what does the environment look like for those students? And so that's led us to the launch of our new Immersive Experiences Lab, so where we can provide students and faculty access to these technologies, not only to have immersive experiences, but also to engage in developing them. And this is kind of the manifestation of the actual pinwheel design that we discovered through a series of experiments on top of the topic. And so in this case, we've gone from what was really early experiments through pilots all the way up to kind of a production environment. And the last thing I want to talk about is kind of the need to create the story that comes from these ideas, because implementing technologies can be costly. It takes a lot of effort and time. And sometimes there's a need to kind of wrap your mind around what is the story you want to tell. So the important thing to remember here, though, is that for people who work in technology, in many ways, you are the least credible people on this topic. And mainly because you work in technology, of course, you're going to think it's a good idea. And so that's where you need to begin to think about, like, what are the value points for this technology, and to begin to develop these stories to begin to inspire and or provoke. And that's why provocation is a really great way of generating new concepts, right? So it's the anti-idea that then becomes this can be the center point of that conversation. So in closing, as we think about this, really what we're talking about is a way of framing thinking, way of approaching projects in a lot of ways, but realizing that innovation isn't a destination. It's not really a thing you can do or achieve, but rather it's this kind of ongoing or enduring commitment to experimentation in a lot of different ways.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kyle and Christopher. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you into breakout rooms with Kyle and Christopher, and we're going to have a note taker and have a discussion about some of the things that you heard today. So give me a moment to do so. I'm going to open up the breakout rooms, and what you'll see is an invitation to join that room. As soon as you join that room, feel free to turn on your video cameras. All right. Sorry to pull you all out of the breakout rooms. I know you had some great conversations going when I popped in. But we want to make sure we have an opportunity to kind of get a sense of what the conversation was like in the other room that you weren't in. So I'd like to kind of regroup and give it over to Christopher to kind of give us a kind of a recap of maybe some of the major themes that you talked about, or some of the interesting solutions that are being brought forward in your group.
So we had two main topics that came up. The first was posed by Jessica, who is at Penn, and it had to do with how do you get the information that faculty are desiring or wanting or needing out to them in order to leverage that and to change their approaches and activities. And she outlined, some pros and cons of different approaches that she's taken, which included, training in a fully online environment, training in a blended environment, and we had someone else in the room offer up an example of a face-to-face. And so we kind of ran the gambit on those and sort of teased out, if you will, for lack of a better word, kind of the benefits and the drawbacks of each of those, without really sort of having a final solution. The other issue that we took up was the challenge really of getting the emerging tech to scale, and what kind of came out of that towards the end was this tension that exists between the need for standardization so that the faculty member can be assured that everyone who is using those devices and those technologies, have access to the same thing in order for the intervention to be successful, versus the ability of scaling up and providing everyone with the iPads or whatever the technology might happen to be to make that work, right? And so there's this tension between scalability and standardization that happens to be present there. So those are the two major things that we have that came up. I'm not sure that we really resolved anything other than that, we kind of outlined or sketched some pros and cons and set the stage for continuing the conversation between, that tension that we observed.
Great. And for those of you not in Christopher's session, what we did is we took some really good notes of what we talked about in that session. So we'll be able to share that out with you for reference. Back to you, Kyle. What kind of themes did you talk about? What kind of solutions are people moving forward?
Sure. Yeah, we had a great conversation. You were chipping away at what we might describe as some grand challenges around kind of engaging faculty. And kind of as I'm reviewing the notes, the neat part of this is organically our conversation seemed to center a lot on, faculty cohorts in terms of bringing faculty together in a lot of different ways, whether it be at University of South Carolina, where they're, experimenting with informal tech review magazines, and which is a really neat idea and one I'd love to learn a lot more about in terms of working with faculty developing rubrics around evaluating technology. And Carlos was talking about his grant process that they use at Texas State, and how do they kind of begin to understand what is involved in the execution or the exploration of what these technologies look like, and how can they help faculty understand all that goes into making that happen. And then we also talked about different types of workshops or programs that can be put into place to help faculty with adoption of technology. And then a brief conversation about virtual reality, and kind of its different uses. And as I kind of issued to the group there, if I could be help, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to share any additional information based on what I talked about today.
Thanks, Kyle. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and wrap up the program. I'd like to thank both of our speakers today, Kyle and Christopher. I went ahead and dropped your Twitter handles in the chat if anyone wants to follow up with you on any of the things they saw today. Participants, if you want more information on anything you saw or heard today from my end, let me know directly by contacting me at alex@nmc.org. To learn more about future NMC online programs and get involved in our community, please visit our website at nmc.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at nmc.org. We have additional programs coming up. As you can see within the Scaling Publications document, there's 8 different topics, and we're going to be hitting those in order between now and December. So if you look at that table of contents, the next topic is EdTech and the Evolving Roles of Faculty. And we're going to have Candace Thiel from Stanford University and another speaker on July 19th. So if that's an interest of yours, it feels like that dovetails in nicely with this topic. That's going to be at July 19th at 12 p.m. Central Time. Thank you for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your week. And we'll see you back here in July. Thanks, everyone.